Well, I'm happy to be here today, and I'd like to thank all the folks that helped put together the Shortleaf Pine Initiative. I've been coming to some meetings for a couple years, and I'm here with my partner, forester Brian Kiefer, and we live and work in a world that you can't imagine. No one's really talked about this much today, but the Shortleaf Pine Initiative is really more than helping shortleaf pine or a forest ecosystem. In the political, social environment that we work in, these are the kind of things that will break through. And you can try to manage all the forests in the world you want in the United States, and until you change the attitude of the public, we're going to fail. And we only need to look to the west this summer to see what's happening. We have got to find a way to bring the public on board with them insisting that these politicians pass laws and regulations that demand and allow forest management to occur. We work in what's called the Pinelands National Reserve. I think there's only 2 reserves in the country. It was created by an act of Congress. That act required the state of New Jersey to develop a regional land plan for 1 million acres of land, including all private land. That occurred in 1979. By the early 1990s, forestry unofficially was essentially not a permitted use. Although the plan talked of the importance of forestry and how the pinelands evolved, preservationists ran the commission. Special interests who influenced the commission want southern New Jersey to be a wilderness and see no role of humans. Now, we work on a forest that has been cut over about 5 times, starting in the 1600s. So you can imagine the disturbance this forest has had in those 400 years, not counting the number of catastrophic wildfires that really, for the first few hundred years, dominated the landscape. The plan makes it illegal to plant any tree that's not indigenous to the Pinelands Reserve. So we were, loblolly pine had been planted, white pine. They became illegal. Dr. Little developed, if you're not aware of, pitch lob, which is a hybrid between a loblolly and a pitch pine, which is the northern loblolly pine that gives us the kind of growth and productivity of a loblolly. That's all was made illegal. What drove me 20-some years towards shortleaf pine is we have a lot of shortleaf pine. It's a significant resource. And I'll start moving these along. That are beautiful, beautiful trees, great timber. But the myth of the Pinelands National Reserve, which was perpetuated and continues to, they try to perpetuate it, is that you can't grow a good tree there. It's scrub land, it's a unique forest ecosystem on planet Earth, and it has to be preserved. But the fact of the matter is, what you see there is the result of hundreds of years of abuse. And many of the forests that look of poor quality are that way because of the environment they grew in, not the genetics of the trees. You only need to look at these kind of stands and you can see that our forest wants to be similar to the forest you see in the southeast, tall, open forests when we burn them. But like you see here, we've had 75 years of really aggressive fire suppression, simply because we have an urban interface on steroids. We have tens of thousands of houses that under the Pinelands plan in the last 35 years have been meticulously set into the forest, making sure they don't cut any trees. So you can imagine the kind of fire hazard we now have. Cutting a 100-foot buffer is not going to do anything when our big fire comes. And I know that a lot of people don't like it when I say it, but the big one is coming, and we will give California all the competition it wants in terms of loss of life and property. So typically, you know, we have these overstocked, fire-excluded forests with tremendous numbers of shortleaf pine in them. And we went about applying, I would say, an ecological approach. We keep all the good trees, and we rarely cut a shortleaf pine. And this is what you end up with. People will say, oh, your forest, it looks like Georgia or Alabama, and I'll say, no, Georgia and Alabama look like our forest. These are primarily, these are almost all shortleaf pine. This was a shortleaf pine forest that I regenerated. We have no problem regenerating shortleaf pine. I mean, it just regenerates easily. This was a whole tree chip harvest, so we had pretty good scarification of the entire forest floor. And there was we typically get an oak mid-story that regenerates under the pine, and you can see that oak trying to resprout. So we cut out 100% of the oak. The real question is, what do you want this to be now? Do you want to put a hot fire through there? Do you want to, you know, grow the next generation and start thinning that young understory, second age class? But we have options. It's very rare in New Jersey to see a young forest. It's really rare to see young trees. They just don't cut trees there. This is a planted shortleaf pine forest on a cornfield. This was a cornfield that I managed the property. The owners really don't care what I do. So I planted shortleaf pine with pitch lob. And they grew so well that we went in and cut the pitch lob out and kept what is really more of a native tree, the shortleaf pine. And I just think it's a myth that shortleaf can't compete with the growth of these other species, because in our area, you can leave there and go to the eastern shore of Maryland where they're really managed loblolly pine. And our trees aren't growing quite as well, but they're pacing right along. If you want timber, if that's, we don't really have any timber industry, we're growing forests. So we're trying to put beautiful forests back on the landscape. This is near there, and this is actually more residual pitch lob, but what I was trying to show is how the grasses and the native herbaceous understory comes right in. Now we will burn this, and you could sustain that for as many decades as you wanted, if that's what you want. The other thing was, I did a bit of an experiment where I left half the cornfield go, and that half of that cornfield is nothing but invasive plants, but very few under the pine. So my position is, some of these old farms, we should be planting pine. Of course, they don't want that because that's a monoculture and that's bad. And but we can certainly get rid of a lot of invasive plants, let these trees get up, put fire in them, have a pretty cool ecosystem as opposed to a field of Russian olive, you know. We have a couple loggers. I have a long history of, I spent 10 years as a forester in Washington State. And my job in Washington for Scott Paper was to help them liquidate their old growth forests. So I know a lot about logging, and I know a lot about bad logging, and I have a history of logging. And I know what good logging is. So the little bit of logging we do, because we have, if we start cutting trees, the police are there within hours, not days. Somebody is on the phone. This has to be illegal. They're building houses. But we found that the Pinelands Commission, who regulates us, they stand by their permits. And once we get a forestry permit, it's valid for 10 years. And we've never had a stop and desist once. Their scientists are beginning to see the value of putting disturbance back on the land. They lost what they preserved in 1979. We have over 150 endangered species. Think of that. When you go to get a forest permit, you're handed a list of over 150 species. And what they're finding is the further decline of all those is because of the lack of disturbance and fire. Forestry was never the problem. In fact, by 1979, what you were really looking at was an artificial forest that was created by haphazard brutalization for hundreds of years. There were no forest practices or any of that. They just chopped the trees down. When the 1979 came, we had 3 pulp mills and over 50 sort of small little sawmill type things. Today we have maybe 1.5 mills. I mean, they went about, if you couldn't get trees, everybody went out of business. So we have sort of maybe the ultimate example of preservation going bad, really bad. Again, this is another tract of land where we go in and we find the shortleafs, we keep them, and it's kind of amazing how many are there. Now, the interesting thing is the law requires that you protect the ecological integrity of the forest. That's the definition. Shortleaf pine is never mentioned. So when I began to do this, there was a pushback saying, oh, he's not going to plant loblolly, he's going to plant these shortleafs. We want this stopped. The commission went to their data and said, no, that's a native tree. We can't do that. The interesting thing about shortleaf, you know, we want to talk about the herbaceous savannas or what have you, but in our forest, I think there was a relationship with fire and shortleaf and pitch with a woody understory. We have a significant scrub oak and vaccinium, huckleberry, and what have you. And you'll see in the photo down the road, this was an oak shortleaf where we cut the oak out for firewood, and this happens all the time, and the shortleaf comes right in. There was no site prep, there was no burning, there was nothing. It just comes right in. So the question becomes, what do you want from that forest? You know, we can't burn that forest. There's houses right in the back of it. So you'll see what we do. This is interesting. This is which I believe is a native forest type, is a pitch pine shortleaf association. And if you don't know, pitch pine is the fire tree. You can burn a mature forest to the ground and that forest will just sprout right out. My personal feeling is that that forest has been thinned once. And like someone was saying earlier, you have to be very careful about taking too much out the first time. It's been burned many, many times. It's ready to burn now. The hardwood is back already. I personally believe when the Europeans arrived and they went out to New Jersey, the first big industry was shipbuilding. They didn't build any ship from these trees. And when I say the industry was big, it was big. We had 2 harbors and all that, and New York City. I believe that they just high graded the shortleaf right out of the forest for the next 100 years or so. If you were building ships or homes or wood, go look at the trees. It's just logical that they would have done that, and I believe they did. This is a typical cleaning where we have mature shortleaves, and we'll go in and cut all the hardwood out for firewood. And again, it's you can't put the trees back. So we'll take a certain percentage out, that regeneration will come, we may go back and take more. But really what we're trying to do is very similar to Stoddard Neal. You know, I've been with Mr. Neal, I've been with Jerry Franklin, they've been to my forest, and it's the exact same thing where you're setting a forest up that can be managed in perpetuity. In perpetuity. And we burn a lot. That's the one good thing about our areas. We have a culture of burning. The cranberry farmers have been burning for 100 years. And so far the government has not harassed that. So we're lucky. This was a pre-commercial thinning. And if you've done it, you burn a pre-commercial thinning, you better know what you're doing because the fuel load is just astronomical. And that's what happens. You know, that's the very stand. It looked like we had burned it to a crisp. But we have more of a woody understory. I do believe if we put fire in our forest a lot for a few decades, we're going to get increases in herbaceous plants. Remember this photo. This was a savanna creation that ended up like that. And the way we did that was we thinned forest out. We actually planted the grasses, 4 native grasses. I don't have the photo. We burned it, and whammo, it's there. Today, that is nothing, which I should have the photo, but a thick, dog-haired, shortleaf pitch pine understory of about 10 feet tall trees because the state bought the land and stopped everything. And that's what Mother Nature does. It's going to put it back to pine. So if I could leave you with anything, we want to be a part of something. We're out there on our own. When tall timbers came, New Jersey Audubon had this grandiose idea that we're going to put quail back. Our quail are extinct. They're gone. And these forests were full of ruffed grouse. And the ruffed grouse are referenced in the Pinelands plan. Gone. 100% extinct. They came to me and said, you're the only manager. We want to talk to your landowners. And I said, don't bother until you get a real quail expert to say this is even, we could talk about it. Because the folks opposed to all this will just say, well, there's Bob looking for another excuse to say that it's okay to cut trees because you're going to help a quail. And tall timbers came, and I spent the day with Theron or whoever, who I believe is the quail man. And at the end of the day, he said, this is amazing. Your land is ready. It's ready now. We'll put birds here next week. They couldn't find a tract of land on the East Coast. And I went to the landowner, who's a very wealthy man, and he said, this would be wonderful. But the quail people don't get to tell the forester what to do. The forester's just going to keep doing what he does. If the quail like that, that's wonderful. But you're not going to come onto my land and start saying, well, we should do this now, and which they wanted to do. He said they're either compatible to how we take care of the stewardship we're providing, or they're not. He said they were here when I was a kid. But the forest got thick and all this. And so I do believe that project is going to get national attention. So far, they've conservatively counted 13 nests the first summer and over 60 chicks. So we know that they're doing okay. From what I understand, the major concern is, will they winter over? Now, there used to be billions of quail in New Jersey, so I think they probably will. And if they do, forestry has no better example of a game, set, match saying, there you go. The other thing about our forest, and shortleaf is our tree, is you could go out there tomorrow where we manage the forest. You could go there on the lowest humidity day with the highest wind, and you won't start a crown fire. That fire will just meander around and go through the forest, and that will come to light someday. When people say, are you telling us we can sort of make our forests resilient to these? Yes, you can, because we did it. Or when the big one comes, the only green spots you'll see. So Mike asked me to come, and it's I don't know what you think of my talk, but it was supposed to be a story. And the future of our forest and forestry is not with economics. It is not. The only hope we have when we talk about landscape level management, that is not going to do it. It's only going to happen when the public begins to say, why aren't you taking care of our land? You know, which they would do. They do it on other issues, but they don't have the information. I think forest industry and we professionals have done a very poor job of getting that message out there. But the good news is, in New Jersey, like I say, we've never had a stop and desist, and every time a mayor or a councilman or somebody who's sent on a mission to basically kill our job finds out what we're doing, at worst they say, I don't think I would do it to my land, but I don't think there's anything wrong with this. The Shortleaf Pine Initiative, when you can say, why don't you go on this website? It's a home run. It's really a home run. And the future of landowners, even down here, I believe, are more New Jersey types. They're not going to be growing trees, so a forester can do a timber sale and he can make a bunch of money. It's going to be more and more and more people who say, I just like to live out there in the privacy or the beauty of the trees or what have you. And the very good news is that people are receptive to this. I have over 800 clients. Think about that, 800 clients. And they're not opposed to logging and cutting trees because of the way we do it and why we do it. They have no interest in making money. I just got a new client, Mike Trout, the baseball player with the Los Angeles. He's like, well, I bought all this land to shoot deer. Yeah, oh, okay, then we can do. Have no problem with fire. So as bad as it is, it's kind of interesting where in some ways New Jersey is coming out the other side, where you're just starting to go in. You know, you don't know what regulations are. You do not know what forest practice regulations are. When you have to get average 3 permits and 3 or 4 letters that verify this or that, and restrict so much of your land from, like we get permits, but if it's a 500-acre tract, we might only be working on 200 acres because barred owl, northern pine snake, corn snake, timber rattlesnake, pine barrens tree frog. I could go on and on. Bobcats are now a hassle. Bobcats love us to do forestry down there. So my message is, this is just a wonderful program that you guys have done. And I don't think a lot of you can appreciate it the way I do, because you're just not, hamstrung in a fashion. Like, you're looking for tools. What can I have that shows I'm a good guy? That shows not only am I a good guy, this land needs this. And our state, who doesn't do any forestry, they have, which you saw, we have stands of shortleaf pine that are over 150 years old, because they bought this land at the turn of the century and locked it up. And it's all either going to burn to the ground or get eaten by pine beetles. It's a tragedy. And we have an opportunity with these kind of programs to really change that. And without it, this cancerous societal nail biting that, we need to save everything, it's just going to overwhelm everything. Conservation is gone in the United States. It's gone. And I said it last night to some folks, if Gifford Pinchot was here today, he would be furious. What are people doing? And Gifford Pinchot would have seen, long before we have, what we were doing wrong with fire. People would have enlightened him or what have you, and he said, look, we started out, it was the natural way. You can't let the fires, but the fire has to be part of who we are and how we live with these lands. And it's up to us now, to do what he would have done, or people like him. You can pick whoever you want. And I think in New Jersey we are. I think we're doing forestry. We have one of our universities just implemented a forest plan on their land. It's going to be huge. It gets great press. And as those research plots bloom, and I just think we have a shot at turning this thing around. But if we don't do something, the West is going to burn to the ground, and people are going to bite their fingernails. And anyone has to look at the Western United States and say, what are we letting happen here? What is going on? So maybe we need a Ponderosa Pine Initiative or something. I don't know. But anyway, that's my